Kia ora koutou. Hello everybody, and thank you very much for tuning in for my presentation. So stone artifacts are a source of direct empirical evidence of past human movement. Approaches such as refitting and more recently the cortex ratio method quantify the physical separation of the products of stone reduction, which is by proxy a direct indicator of human movement once natural transport agents are ruled out. So this paper investigates another such measure, the flake to core ratio, which can indicate movement since adding or removing flakes or cores from an assemblage will affect flake to core ratio values. However, factors such as the initial cobble size and differential reduction intensity first need to be controlled for before inferences about artifact movement can be made. This can be accomplished with a technological analysis. However, while the flake to core ratio indicates movement occurred, it alone says less about the nature of that movement across the landscape. And this is addressed by reusing, with modification, an openly available agent-based simulation of lithic assemblage formation. Simulation outcomes are used to contextualize the results of the flake to core ratio analysis. And this provides an example of how openly available data sets and software may be used to our advantage in addressing new and old research problems. So the case study is Rutherford's Creek in the late Holocene of Western New South Wales. So in the semi-arid margins of the Australian continent, people had to deal with unpredictable environments and appearance of food resources. Ephemeral water sources provided important but intermittent water supplies. And people made use of chipped stone artifacts at Rutherford's Creek, manufactured predominantly from the locally abundant silkreed. Assemblages occur as continuous surface scatters of variable density. The Western New South Wales Archaeology program, or WinSWAP, run by the University of Auckland and Macquarie University, conducted extensive surface surveys along the Rutherford's Creek catchment, targeting areas of high erosion called scalds, and thus high artifact visibility. All artifacts greater than 20 millimeters in maximum dimension were piece plotted using a total station and analyzed in detail. In total, 97 scalds were surveyed with over 27,000 artifacts analyzed. A sample of 10 scalds is used here, totaling just over 9,500 artifacts. So the flake to core ratio, calculated as the number of flakes divided by the number of cores in an assemblage, is a common measure of how intensively stone material has been worked. And traditionally, it's used as an indicator of occupation duration or intensity, both useful concepts in the study of mobility. However, three main factors preclude interpreting flake to core ratios at face value. One is the size of the initial cobble. Holding all else constant, two different size cobbles will provide different numbers of flakes. Another is differential reduction intensity. Simply put, more flakes generated per core increases the flake to core ratio. And a third factor is artifact movement. Holding all else constant, removing flakes from an assemblage decreases the ratio, whereas removing cores increases it, and vice versa. So to understand what the flake to core ratio means in terms of artifact movement, and by proxy human movement, we need to take into account the other two factors. A method of correcting the flake to core ratios according to initial cobble size was employed, and this effectively removes the skew in those values caused by overly large and small cobbles. I'm aware of keeping to time, so won't go into the method in any detail, but I'm happy to answer any questions about it. But essentially, it involves using artifact attributes to infer the predominant reduction strategy used, and then from that, estimate the original cobble sizes. These estimates are then used to correct the observed flake to core ratios. So for Rutherford's Creek, observed flake to core ratios are variable with a large range. Applying that correction method lowers the values and reduces the spread, though some variation is still present. This variation could reflect differential reduction intensity or artifact movement. If differential reduction intensity was a factor, we would expect indicators of high reduction intensity, as expressed in different artifact attributes, to be associated with higher flake to core ratios. But this isn't the case, which leaves artifact movement. Low flake to core ratios then might be explained by the removal of flakes or the addition of cores to an assemblage. But based on the flake to core ratio method alone, it's difficult to tell exactly what kinds of artifacts were moved and what the relationship is between levels of mobility, artifact movement, and the flake to core ratio value. And this is where simulation comes in. Simulation allows the user to experiment with processes otherwise invisible or difficult to replicate in the real world, and where patterning is an emergent outcome of behaviors occurring over large spatial and temporal scales. In the simulation, it's possible to control some variables while adjusting others to understand the effects on simulated outcomes. Importantly, when approached in an exploratory manner rather than an attempt to reconstruct some empirical reality, simulation makes it possible to contextualize observed archaeological patterning in terms of some theoretically relevant processes. So simulation used here is an agent-based model coded in NetLogo and adapted from Davies and colleagues, who provide their code under an MIT license. The original simulation operationalized a highly simplified conceptual model of lithic assemblage formation to explore the effects of different movement and stone reduction practices on the cortex ratio. And here it's modified to explore flake to core ratios. In the simulation, agents move around a window of observation carrying either flakes or cores and discard either flakes or cores with each step that they take. They will flake a core if they're not carrying any material, and if an agent moves outside the window, they are removed from the simulation, along with any flakes or cores they're carrying, and at that point, a new agent enters. Raw material is considered to be always available. Flake and core size are held constant, and a core can produce 20 flakes when fully reduced. The number of flakes produced in a reduction event is controlled by a reduction parameter, and how many are then selected for transport is controlled by a selection parameter. Agents may also enter the window carrying a varying number of flakes or cores. Agent movement is expressed in varying degrees of tortuosity, from highly linear movements, such as on the left-hand side there, to highly tortuous moves, such as on the right-hand side. And this affects how long an agent spends in the window of observation, and thus how many artifacts are discarded and how much material might leave the area with the agent. Simulations end when 100 agents have passed through, and each combination of parameters is run 100 times. And at the end of each simulation, the flake to core ratio is recorded. So here are 95% confidence envelopes showing flake to core ratios when flakes are when flakes are targeted for transport. Each graph represents a different level of reduction, and the blue segments represent different selection intensities, and the red line is the expected flake to core ratio in each case. We see that variation in ratios decreases as movement becomes more tortuous, or as agents spend longer in the window of observation. And this is because there's a greater chance of discarding all flakes that were generated rather than carrying them out of the window. And that brings the flake to core ratio closer to what would be expected. The opposite is true of more linear movements, where there's a higher chance of material leaving before being discarded. Therefore, the ratios are more variable. And reduction in selection intensity needs to be high enough for that variation to emerge. So this patterning can be further explored by examining the effects of bringing material into the window from outside. Here, reduction in selection is set at 100%, so every flaking event produces the full possible 20 flakes. When no flakes are brought in with an agent, the flake to core ratios sit below the expected value, reflecting the fact that flakes can only move out of the window. When the maximum number of flakes are brought in, ratios are higher than expected since flakes are being added to the assemblage. Particularly when movement is more linear, flakes that are brought in are discarded first before local material is worked. And since there's a higher chance of leaving without discarding many flakes, the ratio is much higher. Increased tortuosity, so agents sticking around longer, means that local production and discard occur more equally. moving that flake core ratio closer to the expected value. So here we've observed the combined effect of differing movement and flake transport processes on flake core ratios. But what about if cores are transported? So here cores are moved and discarded each step rather than flakes. If the agent toolkit is empty, a number of cores are flaked and the flakes are discarded. One core is then discarded every step that the agent takes. So we would expect, if no cores were brought in or removed, that flake core ratios would be equal to the number of flakes removed from a core. And as tortuosity increases, flake core ratios approach this value as the chance of local discard increases. So similar to what we saw with flake movement, tortuosity is controlling the variation in flake core ratios around an expected value. Lower tortuosity or more linear movement produces more variable ratios, since cores have a higher chance of leaving the window without being discarded. Producing more cores when in need of material also contributes to the variation, since all cores are flaked at once, so then more flakes are being discarded, therefore increasing the flake core ratio. And this is especially in lower tortuosity settings, when cores have a greater chance of leaving the window before being discarded. So like before, we can examine the effect of importing material, this time cores, into the window. And ultimately, the pattern is similar to what we observed when flakes were the target of transport, only this time it's flipped. When material is brought in the form of cores, the flake to core ratio is lower, and vice versa. So what do these results mean for the corrected flake to core ratios? Well, if we remember, those values were all quite small, and arguably they were lower than what we would expect. Markers such as the number of dorsal scars on flakes and the number of scars on cores suggests that more than only 2 to 3 flakes on average were removed from a core. So in the simulation, the lowest flake to core ratios are produced when movement is more linear. In the case of flake transport, low values only occur when no material or little material is imported, but instead flakes are predominantly leaving the window. If cores are targeted, low values only occur when cores are brought in from elsewhere, when material enters the window. So we've now got a sense of how different combinations of movement and artifact import and export impact the flake to core ratio, all while holding cobble size and reduction intensity constant. So for Rutherford's Creek, the mass import of material doesn't make sense if raw material is locally abundant. So the removal of material from the area is more parsimonious. Corrected ratios are quite low, and the simulations suggest that we would expect to see lower ratios as movement is more linear, or in real-world terms, people are highly mobile, not spending much time in one place. If people did spend more time in one place, we would expect to see higher corrected flake to core ratios than what we otherwise do. And in fact, this interpretation of movement of flakes away from an area is consistent with the results of other published independent measures of artifact movement, namely the cortex ratio. So people were highly mobile, okay, as a way of dealing with unpredictable environments and appearance of food resources. So to summarize, stone artifacts are a useful source of information about past mobility, particularly when approached in terms of the physical separation of the products of stone reduction. Computer simulation, when approached in an exploratory manner rather than as an attempt to reconstruct an empirical reality, is useful for understanding the outcome of processes of interest that are otherwise invisible to archaeologists or logistically difficult to experiment with. And in this manner, the simulation serves as a heuristic device or a tool with which to think about archaeological patterning. And finally, there is an increasing push for open data and open science in archaeology, with reproducibility a key part of the scientific method. This availability of data presents a valuable opportunity to utilize existing data sets and software to not only reproduce and validate previous studies, but extend them further and address new problems. So I would just like to acknowledge the Western New South Wales Archaeology program for the use of data. And I would like to acknowledge Davies and colleagues for providing the original simulation code, which was adapted for use here. And finally, to the Faculty of Arts Scholarships at the University of Auckland for financial support. And thank you very much for listening to my presentation. Kia ora.